Welcome to the CAS-E podcast, The Resilience of Magic in Modernity, Part 2.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, and we will discuss it later in greater detail. For now, let's basically note down that magic has for a long time oscillated between stigmatization and fascination, and we've discussed more the stigmatizing part, but let's move a bit more to fascination. So why has it this strong appeal throughout history, but maybe the more so today? And I would maybe like to ask you, Andrea, because you're connected to a network of esoteric practitioners. What did you learn about what drives them? What is their fascination with these practices?
First of all, I think it is important to say that the motivation to practice magic or the fascination with magical practices varies enormously from one geographical region to the other. In some non-European or non-Western countries, magical practices understood in the broad sense, for instance, practices which deal with other than human entities, are integrated within society and are not necessarily stigmatized. In this context, the motivation to practice magic can follow criteria such as affiliation or the identification of an inborn talent by the community. The second disclaimer I must make is that while RANCEP aims to transcend Western-centric approaches and include practitioners from a wide range of cultural and religious backgrounds, the majority of its current members resides in Western countries. RANCEP is still a very young network. And even in the Western context, it is challenging to generalize the motivations of practitioners, as one of the defining features of magic, particularly in the Western context, is that it is an individualized form of spirituality. Therefore, motivations can vary from one individual to another. Additionally, magical traditions are diverse. Some are more focused on achieving practical results, while others emphasize the quest for knowledge or the practitioner's personal spiritual elevation. Therefore, it's not an easy question to answer. However, there are common factors of motivation or fascination that can be identified. The most important one, in my opinion, is the efficacy of magical practices. Magical practices are almost always oriented toward the achievement of a result, either in the world or within oneself. Most of the practitioners report experiences of efficacy. They might not always be able to explain why magic works, but what matters to them is that it does. So from this perspective, magic is seen as a highly practical technology. Whether these claims are based on objective factors or not is a question that must be elucidated by experimental research. And I must say that at RANCEP we are already making small steps in this direction. Indeed, last year we funded, in collaboration with the Institute of Noetic Sciences, the first experimental research on the efficacy of sigil magic. The second important motivation behind the practice of magic is its transformative power on the self. During a magical ritual, the network of relationships the practitioner has with the world, with other humans, with spiritual entities changes. This is something that has been mentioned by Richard Kiekefer. And this reconfiguration of the network of relationships can last even after the magical ritual. Moreover, occult theories entail the existence of parallel worlds, such as the astral plane, and of hidden forces. The manipulation of these forces provides practitioners with experiential knowledge, which in turn changes their perspective on life. Practitioners report meaningful and transformative experiences that provide them with insights on reality, which result in a sense of freedom or self-empowerment. Finally, I think that the artistic dimension must not be neglected. Magic entails the fabrication of objects, and some rituals could be seen as small plays or artistic performances. We can think, for instance, of the rituals performed by Aleister Crowley, which had a theatrical character and included also musical performances. As Judith already mentioned, magic and art are deeply intertwined. So in this perspective, magic is also a form of artistic expression. I think that while many other factors might motivate or fascinate individuals in their engagement with magic, these three dimensions, efficacy, self transformation, and art, stand out as the most common and significant.
Okay, thank you very much, Andrea. That's very interesting. I think we have to take one step back and discuss the relationship between ritual magic or types of ritual practice that we discuss here to other discourses about magic, especially what is known as stage magic or illusionism, but also the very wide-ranging field of fantasy magic in books, in television series, and so on. And I would like to ask you, Marco, where do you see the interconnections between these three fields? Ritual magic on the one hand, stage magic on the other, and finally fantasy magic, which is probably the most well-known field to most people today.
Yes, of course. It's clear that all these things are related to each other because if the same term is being used for them, magic, it means that there is at least one part of their history that is common, that is shared between them. Now, as I said earlier, I think that for me, magic is basically the idea that you can transform reality. And with stage magic, you create the illusion that you're doing that. Now, of course, you do this with tricks. So this is known by the person who is doing that, and it's known by the audience. You don't know what the tricks are, but the idea is that you enjoy a show which is entertaining. Um, and for a long time, this was actually called magic, and people use the term magic to participate in this social situation. And as a small anecdote, I have to say that as a child, I actually my first exposure, so to speak, to magic was through a handbook of stage magic. So this is where I became acquainted for the first time with the term magic and what magic was about. And then you have what you called fantasy magic, which is magic in all sorts of media, like literature, in series, for instance, films, and so on. Now, it's clear that what you see there is an image of what magicians do. So again, it's about the interaction with reality, with a transformative power by the use of extraordinary means. Um, Now, this is usually set in a context that is imaginative. So this takes place very often in situations that are in another period of time, or actually in an alternative reality. Now, I think that certainly these stories have the power to entertain. So there is something about them that people like. So they like this kind of stories, I guess, especially people in a younger age. And I think they can have a very powerful effect of acting as models. So people knowing about these stories, listening to these stories, or reading about these stories, can get ideas about what magic does and how you use it, which in some cases I think can turn into lived experience because you read about these things and then this is what you want to do in your life. You want to act on it. So I wouldn't underestimate, for instance, the influence that Harry Potter stories have had also in the incredible boom that the interest in magic and also the new positive appreciation or fascination for magic has had in contemporary societies.
Hmm. Yes, I could maybe briefly add that there are many also historical intertwinements. So it's quite interesting that the history of stage magic really kicked off in the 19th century with Houdin and Houdini. And in a way, they took one particular idea from the history of magic, namely to produce miracles, to fly, to walk through walls, and so on. And they took this out of the history of magic because there are historical scripts full of rituals that allegedly help you achieve these things.
To
And
go underwater also,
yes,
as we heard
many
earlier.
different miraculous deeds, and they put it on stage and started doing this as a trick. So I think there's even more to say about that. And then there's the other direction, as you said, fantasy magic influences possibly practitioners or to be practitioners. So it's like an entry door into the field of ritual magic. But then there's also the other side, namely that the fictional authors, they are to a greater or lesser degree inspired by historical documents about
Absolutely.
magic. So we know about Joanne K. Rowling that she has read a lot about the actual or the real history of magic, even though she then transformed it into a largely fantastic enterprise and universe where the principles of magic do not have much to do with what real world magicians do.
Yep.
But I would like to ask you, Judith, because you're also raising your hand. Maybe that's not the thing that you wanted to say, but maybe you can begin by explaining how you interpret the extreme popularity of fantasy stories in the 20th century, positive fantasy stories about magicians who save the world, if you like Harry Potter or Gandalf in Lord of the Rings. How do you explain
Surely,
this?
well, I think on a really basic level, if the world becomes disenchanted, then fantasy is the place where people can find something that addresses the need in themselves for magic, which I think is a fairly deep need in most of us. So on a very general level, I think that's the basic premise. But while Marco's addressing that and you're talking about Harry Potter, I think one thing that is quite specific is what is written for children and young people. And Harry Potter is a supreme example of that. And I've noticed since, if you like, since the beginning of the Harry Potter phenomenon, people who come to be trained in witchcraft, in serious self-transformational witchcraft, will almost now invariably cite Harry Potter as one of the places where they first got interested in magic. It's all pervasive. But I suppose I would also think back further than that to my own childhood, and exactly the same process would be going on. And I think particularly of someone who I think is one of the most amazing British writers still with us, and that's Alan Garner, who began by writing children's books. And you find those provided an extraordinary introduction to magic and witchcraft. And not only that, but when you look at those children's books now, they have real sigils. The sigil of Arbatel is in Garner's Moon of Agomrath, and a really deep working knowledge from someone who was themselves a practitioner. So I think this intertwining is becoming ever more prevalent and complex, really. That was how I wanted to address that.
Yeah.
I have to unteach Harry Potter
Yeah.
to students of witchcraft.
You mentioned an interesting thing, namely that the extreme popularity of fantasy magic could also be interpreted as a resistance against a more secularized outer world. So, in a way, the world is not disenchanted or secularized as we think it is, but fantasy magic and the whole genre kind of shows the momentum of the interest and the fascination of the people in this fantastic realm, which is not only always there, but it becomes stronger and stronger all throughout the 20th century. I think this is an interesting observation in itself. And with that, I think we're already with one foot in the next thing that we wanted to discuss in this podcast, namely the question of resilience. And we've already mentioned the Harry Potter novels now. I think they have really been a game changer from a global perspective, with 500 million sold book copies. So it's basically the most read story of the past 150 years. But you can also see that, as you said, Judith, in the ever greater popularity of magical religions such as Wicca, the witchcraft religion founded in the 50s by Gerald Brousseau Gardner, which, according to some estimates at least, has several million adherents all over the world now. They will not all be initiated, but they are on the fringes of what is sometimes called neo-paganism. So a magical revival, if you like. But you can also see it in social media and the phenomenon of witch talk, where fast food-like short magical recipe videos receive many millions of clicks. So it is obviously really a thing in the young generation now. And another example is maybe the manifestation movement, which also goes under the name law of attraction, but basically it's a new variant of also a new religious movement called New Thought that was founded in the late 19th century. But it is extremely popular now. So well-known trainers, they fill halls with tens of thousands of interested people who want to change their lives with very simple imagination techniques, if you like. And as we here have a center on esoteric practices from a global perspective, I would also like to expand this perspective a bit and add the phenomenon of spiritism or spiritist cultures from a global perspective. So if you include, for instance, the voodoo religion, which originated in West Africa, you have estimates of more than 60 million adherents worldwide. And if you add to that South American spiritist movements such as Candomblé or Umbanda, Santeria, or also if we go more into the Asian continent, you have also spiritist religions such as Cao Dai, Bön, or Shinto. And if you add these to the basket of what we could maybe call magic, or at least esotericism from a global perspective, then you have hundreds of millions of practitioners. So it's really not a marginal phenomenon that we are speaking about here. And I would maybe like to begin this part of the discussion with a question to Andrea, because Andrea brought an Islamic practice to the table, while we three, Judith, Marco, and I, we presented something that maybe belongs more to European or Western magic. And how do we open up the horizon? How do we broaden the concept to include, for instance, an Islamic practice, but maybe also a South American or an African spiritist practice? How do we do that? Does that make sense? Andrea, what would be your argument?
In the context of Islamic occult sciences, the term magic translates the Arabic sihr. So this reinforces the applicability of the term magic to describe practices found in Islamic occult sciences. However, in the example I described in the introduction, so the Sufi letrist practice of Al-Buni, I use the term magic anachronistically to refer to practices aimed at achieving a perceived tangible outcome in the world, as Al-Buni did not regard these practices as sihr. Moreover, within the context of Al-Buni's letrism, the magical dimension must also be contextualized within a theurgic context, where, similarly to Neoplatonism, magical operations are part of a larger system of correspondences between microcosm and macrocosm, and also include the salvific goals. This being said, the example I gave demonstrates that the term magic can be employed as a second-order analytical category, so as a purely ethic term, which can be used to gather information across different cultural and religious contexts. In this perspective, if the relationship with spirits, for instance, is identified as one of the defining features of magic, then of course we can include many other traditions worldwide, such as the spiritist practice that you have mentioned, Bernd, thus changing the overall picture on the practice of magic. Indeed, as you mentioned, magic used as an ethic category could include hundreds of millions of practitioners, questioning its perceived marginality. The difficulty of this approach resides, of course, in the identification of common features to all these practices and in the methodological challenges that come with comparativism. An interesting avenue which RANCEP plans to explore in the future builds on UNTAVE's inventory of non-ordinary experiences. This is a classification of non-ordinary experiences that distinguishes between the phenomenological aspect of these experiences from their cultural interpretations. If this approach is applied to magic, this would allow for the investigation of both potential universal and culture-specific features of magic. For instance, practices involving the interaction with spirits could be categorized as presence-related practices, and therefore can be juxtaposed to practices involving the evocation of demons in Western magic. This framework could allow comparisons between, for instance, Western ceremonial magic, South American or African spiritist practices, or Mongolian shamanism, just to name a few examples.
So now we're right in the middle of the conversation about the popularity of present-day practices and the potential resilience of magic in esoteric instrumental practices in the 20th and 21st century. And the listener might wonder, what is going on? Why have these practices not faded away? Why do they seem ever more popular? After all, scientific and technological rationalities, they are a very powerful hegemonic discourse. All over the world, there are schools, universities where we are certainly trained that these things are not efficient, and it's weird that people continue to practice that and to believe in that. So there are these ongoing counter-educators, if you like schools, public education, public media. But still, it doesn't seem to fade away. It is resilient. This is the main question of today's podcast. Judith, from the perspective of your own knowledge and expertise and in the area of art, how would you interpret that resilience?
Well, I'd start by observing that throughout the history of magic, the idea that it's backward looking and is dying out has been present in official culture, but magic has survived that right through the ages we're talking about, and certainly through the 20th century when it was supposed to be not needed anymore, and very dramatically. For example, in the 1920s, after the First World War, there was a mass turning to magical techniques, especially on the part of women. There was essentially an attempt to contact dead loved ones who'd been killed in the war. And so this never, on a popular and folk level, no, this never went away. From my own perspective, and in terms of art and culture, the last 20 years really have seen a quite extraordinary turn in art and in looking at art history too, away from the purely materialistic to a view which places spirituality and also magic center stage, really. When I began my own career in the late 1970s, my great interest was in surrealism, and I was told to forget that if I wanted to be an artist. And it was precisely all those things that surrealism foregrounded: the irrational, working with the unconscious, working with the deep imaginal. That was what the art world at that time disliked and distrusted intensely. I didn't expect that to change really during my lifetime. I thought it was just the orthodox that you had to live with, but it has, to the extent that we now look at more and more major exhibitions dealing with artists for whom the spiritual and the magical is at the front of what they do. And I'd cite recent I'd really want to cite work by 20th century women artists, especially those who came out of Surrealism, for whom this became such a concern. So I'd really like to mention Leonora Carrington, Remedios Varo, Leonor Fini, and perhaps supremely Ethel Cahoon, whose first major retrospective will open at Tate in Cornwall early in 2025. That is so important. I think it's also no coincidence that much of this work is being done by women, because I also think that for me, one of the things that really refreshed and regenerated the magical culture, if you like, the occulture, was the growing involvement of women informed by feminism from the 1970s onwards, which you can see in many ways in the goddess spirituality movement, but also permeating other magical discourses, witchcraft certainly. You know, for those who've not experienced it, pagan witchcraft, Wicca, is about putting the idea of the divine female at the heart of what you do and giving it the kind of reversing the patriarchal norm and giving it precedence over the male. So that's there. But I would also cite the social movements of the 70s and 80s, feminism, and very importantly, the Western European peace movements, notably the women at Greenham Common in the UK, for whom magical practice and goddess spirituality was a lived, very present reality. And that got into the culture on a really interesting level. And again, art has been reflecting that recently. A recent show, again, it's in Britain, but at Tate, Women in Revolt, look back at that period and the work that many of us were doing at the time, which seemed at the time quite messy, anarchic, and under the cultural radar, but is now being seen as an important part of a kind of cultural change and that turn towards the magical. So that's quite a long and rambling answer. But I think I just want to add as well, when you talk about the practice of popular magic, that, you know, show me a girl in her early teens just experiencing menarche who does not want to practice operational magic, you know, alone in her bedroom or with friends. I don't think you can find one. It's physical and embodied, as well as an intellectual and cultural concern. So that's my rambling answer, I suppose.
So boiling it down, or if I understood you correctly, so there was always an interrelation with art and magic, which became stronger and stronger, especially during your lifetime. In a way, it has always been a refugee place, because you could kind of practice art in a half real environment. So art has always had the most liberty.
It's similar to literature.
Similar to
similar.
literature.
It's
So
similar.
you could maybe be thought that you don't mean it fully serious because it's art, but you could still practice.
Or also you could be critiqued in a way that didn't describe your practice fully. So, for example, you know, between the end of the Second World War and the 1990s, which is in art, the disenchantment period that we're talking about, artists were talking about Jungian psychology and archetypes and finding the spiritual in their work. And perhaps the supreme example for me is the American abstract expressionist painter Jackson Pollock, who's thought of the epitome of that kind of materialist tendency, who was saying, you know, come on, guys, my work comes from my engagement with my Native American heritage and from Jungian psychology, and it's for me, it's a deeply spiritual practice. And the critics who are writing about him were saying, isn't it great? He's dripping paint on canvas, and there's nothing but that to it. So they, you know, the cultural critique was dismissing the magical in work, even when artists said it was there. Yeah, the filmmaker Maya Deren, who I've said a lot, is another really good example of that.
So we could see this in a way as a resilience factor, the whole field of art